Hello, I'm Rudy Volkman, and today I'm going to be talking about pistol grips, also known as orthopedic grips. I'll be discussing their history, how to properly fit one to your hand, and then how to properly use one once you have one that fits. Now, this is a fairly long video, so we've divided this into chapters. And if you decide that you don't want to watch the whole thing and you just want to cue in on one of those three topics, you can choose from the time bar at the bottom of the screen. To begin with, it might be interesting to talk about where these things came from. How did we get pistol grips? After all, for 400 or 500 years, the only thing that swords people had to work with was either the French grip, essentially a stick with some curves in it to make it a little bit more ergonomic, or what was known as the Italian grip with its cross piece. Obviously, the French grip is still around. A lot of epeists use it, but to the best of my knowledge, no strong competitive foilist is still using a French grip. It should be held like this: thumb and forefinger making a hinge. Note the angle of the thumb here. The other fingers, doesn't matter if you can get them all on or not, go onto the grip itself. The pommel should be in the wrist so that it acts essentially as an extension of the forearm. Epeists tend to hold it like this, and they call that posting. The old Italian handle actually made it well into the 20th century. In fact, the last fencer I know of that used one successfully was an international champion named Maurice Kami. Fascinating fellow. He escaped from Bosnia, moved to New York City, where he became a film producer and, of course, a competitive fencer. He beat the then reigning Olympic champion, Ian Drimba, twice at the Martini Rossi tournament in New York in 1969. I had the pleasure of meeting him in 1974 when my friend Andy Shaw brought him to Atlanta for a visit. The Italian handle is meant to be held like this. There's a hole in what passes for a pommel on this that is to accommodate a leather strap that you can wrap around your wrist called a martingale. It's still quite legal. I actually thought that these had gone completely extinct, but it turns out that one of the vendors is still carrying them, the electric version, and you can buy one and you can use it in competition. But this is about pistol grips. How did they get into the picture? Well, it turns out that people have been trying to experiment with orthopedic grips all the way back to the 19th century. In fact, one was demonstrated at a Paris convention of fencers in 1904, but none of them were particularly successful. And the story of the first commercially successful and available pistol grip goes something like this, as I'm given to understand it. An Italian fencing master named Francesco Visconti moved to Belgium, and shortly after World War I, he evidently had a little bit too much of the French vino and managed to fall under a moving trolley car. And after the dust had settled and he came out of the hospital, he had lost part of his hand and he couldn't hold on to a French handle anymore. And he really wanted to keep fencing. So either he designed or he had designed an orthopedic grip that would allow him to continue to compete. Now, evidently, it was a pretty good grip because once he showed up using it, a lot of other people wanted to use it. And so it went into manufacture and sales and became known as the Belgian grip. And now you would think that they would name it after him because, after all, he was the one that either invented it or had it invented. But in fact, it became known as the Belgian grip because of a fairly interesting story as my friend Joseph Burns tells it. Now, you might want to look up Joe Burns. He was a pillar of American fencing for the better part of 50 plus years. And if anybody knew the real story, it would be Joe. Now, according to him, it became known as the Belgian grip rather than the Visconti grip because the French used to tell ethnic jokes aimed at the Belgians, a little bit like Americans used to tell jokes aimed at Polish citizens or the Irish. Germans tell Chinese jokes. But evidently, when the people showed up to fence with these, the French purists among them looked at the grips and said, "Ha ha, I see you're using a Belgian grip," and the name stuck. The Belgian grip, incidentally, only comes in one size. And that's all there was for many, many years. You had the French, the Italian, and the Belgian grip that were being used in fencing. Then, sometime in the very early 60s, the Negrini company in Italy decided that they could do a little bit better than the Belgian grip in terms of creating an orthopedic grip to be used. And so they came up with their own, and it became known as the Negrini Visconti because they decided to go ahead and honor the inventor of this first commercially available orthopedic grip. It looks like this. The Negrini Visconti is simply called the Italian grip by most of the vendors today, and it comes in 5 sizes. And you can tell what size you're dealing with from a distance simply by the shape of the tang. The extra small and the extra large both have these odd pointed tangs. The small and the large both have this kind of shape. And the medium has this odd little curve on it. A few years later, the Germans decided to get into the act. The Ullmann company decided that they could do better than the Negrini folks could. And so they came up with what was called the Ullmann Visconti. You'll notice it has a very long tang to it, a unique shape. Most vendors today just call it the German grip. It, like the Belgian, only comes in one size. And a few years later than that, the Russians got into the act with the Russian grip. The Russians solved the matter of the size by simply removing all of the finger grooves completely. So it fits a number of different size hands. And that's about it of the commercially available pistol grips that I'm aware of that we use today. Now, you'd think that with essentially 8 different grips to choose from, that would be fairly simple to find one that fits your hand, but nothing could be further from the truth. Sometime in the 1990s or so, all of the international patents ran out on these, and all the manufacturers started making their own versions. The vendors that you think of are actually also manufacturers of their own stuff. And so, in alphabetical order, Absolute Fencing Gear, All-Star, Blue Gauntlet, Fencing Post, Leon Paul, PBT, and Triplet Competition Arms all have their own versions of all of these grips. And they're all different sizes. And in fact, I'm told that in the 2020s or so, the Japanese team started using 3D printers to make their grips particular to each one of their fencers. You probably won't have to deal with that. But the fact is that there are probably 40 or 50 different actual sizes of grips out there nowadays. And about the only way you can go about getting one that actually fits you best is to go to either a NAC or one of the other very large tournaments where there are many vendors and try all of them out individually. So here is my suggested process for properly fitting a pistol grip. So first and foremost, this muscle of the thumb should fit into the tang of the handle comfortably, and then the thumb and forefinger should be able to make a hinge like that. Note that the thumb angle is the same as it was on the French grip. This is too flat. This is probably too high. And you don't want some kind of a forked fingering like this. You want the thumb and forefinger to make a hinge that allows you to maneuver the blade. The tang has to be able to move. This is critical. Having done that, the pads, not the tips, but the pads of the fingers should lie comfortably on the grooves in the handle if this handle has grooves. You should be able to maneuver the blade like this with the thumb and forefinger being the hinge. The tang should probably be felt in the wrist. It's fairly critical that the pads of the fingers go onto the handle itself. If you clutch it like this, grab it, then you have lost that hinge. And instead of having a hinge at the thumb and forefinger, you have a hinge in the wrist, which is the last thing you want in moving your blade around. Now, I think that your brain feels the triangulation in your hand and gives you a feel for where the tip is on the foil. I think it's why most of the grips that have come out that don't have a tang aren't very successful. I think when those first came out, all of us got one because they just feel so comfortable. And then we all put them away because we'd lost some of our point control. I think it's important that you be able to feel this point and these points in the course of creating your map of where your tip is. A little on the controversial side is the matter of hand rotation. I think there are a number of reasons why your thumb should be over at the 45-degree mark, we say the 130 position on a clock, rather than thumb on top. You can do very quick disengages like this, but you've lost the hinge to make a beat. You have, because you have no place for the tang to go, you end up using it with the wrist, where with a 45-degree position you can beat and disengage without changing the angle of the hand. So once you have figured out which handle fits your hand best and you're holding it correctly, the problem now is how do we use it correctly? And just like the French handle, you want a hinge here. In fact, you should be able to maneuver the blade with your thumb and forefinger, with these fingers just helping out. Now, if this is going to stay put and be the hinge, then it means that this has to be able to move. And in fact, sometimes the wrist even moves, but not as a hinge, but rather as opposition to the blade. So if the blade is going down and you want this to stay put, then this has to come up. For example, after a parry 4, you want the fingers to put the point back in line as you're extending, not locking your hand and riposting like this. So after a parry, this should happen, not this. And a disengage should look like that, not like that. Putting the point back in line is particularly important after a low line parry. It's important in the high line parries as well, but from the low line parries, it's critical that you don't extend like this, but like that. Ideally, this guard, this point in space, stays put throughout all of your blade actions. Circles are made like this, not like this. Disengages, beats, all of these actions should happen in the fingers and in the hand, not with the wrist as a hinge. So a counter 6 should look like this, not like this. 4, counter 4, not 4, counter 4. The same with 7. The counter parry should have the guard not moving, not like this. And 8, the same. Disengages after an extension should look like this, not that. Counter disengages, much the same. The tip moves, but the guard doesn't. So an extension with a disengage should look like that, not like that. Counter disengages are out here. This shouldn't move. Common move is a beat followed by a disengage, and it should look something like this, not that. Now, like everything in fencing, there are really no absolutes. So there are going to be variations on all of these things that I've discussed. In fact, there's a secondary hand position on which I have a different video. But I hope you've gotten the idea of how to fit your hand to a handle, or vice versa, fitting the handle to your hand, and some information on how to correctly use it. Thank you for watching.